So I'm Dan Trueman, and I am the chair of the music department at Princeton, and have been teaching here for a little over 20 years. In fact, Greg and I just put a finger on the fact that we both came to Princeton at the same time. I joined the faculty in 2002, and Greg came into the grad program at the time in 2002. And you were one of my very first dissertation advisees. I think Simon Morrison and I advised you on your dissertation back on the last page of Mahler 9.
Yeah.
A whole dissertation on the last page of Mahler 9. It was wonderful, actually.
150 pages on one page.
150 pages on one page, that's right, yeah. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to introduce both of them, and we'll listen to a short clip of music from first Greg and talk a little bit, and then from Nina and talk a bit there, and then have some questions, some conversation, take some questions from you as there's interest, and we'll just see what happens. Going from one of the first graduate students I worked with to one of our more recent, Nina Shekhar. So Nina came to Princeton fall of 2020. Well, she didn't actually come to Princeton in the fall of 2020. She was starting in our program, but basically nobody was coming to Princeton in the fall of 2020 because of the COVID catastrophe. So I remember we had a number of Zoom meetings and so on during that year. But Nina came to us first at University of Michigan studying composition and chemistry, as you do. That's just something that people do. I might ask you more about that later. I studied physics as an undergrad, so we have something maybe similar or maybe not. I don't know. And so you did a dual degree there at University of Michigan in composition and chemistry, but were you studying performance there too? I know you're a pianist and a flute player and sax player and so on.
Yeah, not technically, but the way it worked at Michigan, the flute professor there, her studio was very intense. So it felt like another major too, like a performance major, even though I wasn't technically getting a degree.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So then you went from there to University of Southern California and got a master's in composition there. Mm-hmm. And who were some of the people you worked with there?
Yeah, there I studied with Ted Hearn was my main mentor, and Andrew Norman also.
Yeah, both great composers. Nina is in the fourth year of our grad program. Lest you think, she's a student, beginning composer. Far from it. You can find incredible words about her from the New York Times, from the LA Times. She's had work done by the New York Phil, the LA Phil, and you name it. So super accomplished composer, musician, thinker, and we're really pleased to have her here in the grad program. I'll actually say a little story about our grad program while I'm prolonged introductions here, if that's okay. The grad program in composition at Princeton, which drew both of these wonderful composers here and drew me here as well. You might not know it, but it's one of the top in the world. It's also always neck and neck with the astrophysics program as being the most competitive to get into on the whole of campus at Princeton University. About 2% of the applicants get in. It's a ridiculously difficult process going through that. So the level of the composers is super high, and we tend to. Paul Lansky told me. Paul Lansky, some of you may remember or know, he was on the faculty. He's now emeritus. He was on the faculty for 40 odd years in the music department here. And he told me 30 years ago, he said, well, in this program, we admit the best composers we can into this graduate program, and then we learn from them, which has definitely been my experience. We bring these incredible composers here, and I learned so much from having composers like Nina and Greg here. So she's in her fourth year, but we really, I think, see ourselves as a community of peers trying to become better at what we do, rather than some hierarchical setup with mentors and students. So that was a digression on your introduction. And then so after USC, you joined us in 2020. Been here for a few years. Anything to add to that biography?
I mean, It's been wonderful being here. I'll just say this as we're talking about Princeton's department. I think it's a really rare environment. It's a beautiful town. I mean, I came from LA right before this, which was very different than being here, both in terms of the weather and the city. But just to have this amazing community where we have wonderful faculty like Dan and just wonderful peers and this network, even in terms of alumni, that, I always feel really connected with everybody here. And I think it's a rare space where students also get a lot of freedom to explore and evolve and grow, which I definitely felt like I have here. So I just want to say it's lovely to be here and to work with Princeton Symphony this week.
Yeah. Cool. We'll talk some more later. Greg, as I said, sort of an earlier generation of composers in the grad program, has been out for many years now. But you had a fairly prolonged stay here because you did your normal 4 years or whatever it was, and then you taught writing in the writing program. I'm going to actually go in a circle here. So before that, if I remember correctly, you went to Eastman for composition.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And then to Yale, second-rate school up north. Yeah. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So you went to Yale, got a master's there.
That's right.
And then came to Princeton.
Actually, went to Denmark for a year before.
Went to Denmark.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, with Hans Abrahamsen.
Oh, Hans Abrahamsen. Yeah, wonderful. And so then you came here and then spent. What's interesting about that trajectory also is that conservatory training doesn't necessarily include learning how to write words like prose, but writing is super important to you, and you became one of the core instructors in the writing program at Princeton, which is about educating Princeton students how to write paragraphs and sentences and convincing arguments. And, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Oh gosh,
that's a curious
I don't know
thing.
that I do.
He was great at it.
Oh yeah. Well, and I never took a writing class because I went to music school, and I think I took 2 humanities classes the whole time. So it was interesting. For me, writing was always something I had to think about doing, and so maybe that made me identify with the students who were really trying to figure out how to put together a technique to do that. But it was fascinating work. I still use all the metaphors that now that I'm teaching composing. That we used in the curriculum here. So it was a great experience. Yeah.
Apparently Bach, back when he was teaching composition occasionally, he mostly actually taught rhetoric.
Interesting.
Taught the art of rhetoric, not necessarily just literally making arguments. So there's something about writing the arguments in music.
There's one thing, just because you brought that up, that I think about all the time. There's this thing, Amanda's the head of the writing program here. There's one thing that they talk about a lot in the Princeton writing program. It's something called motive. It's like this mysterious thing. So it's not your thesis. It's the implicit part of your paper that is arguing, oftentimes under the surface, as to why what you're writing is important and why the argument is worth spending some minutes reading. Like op-eds always have this aspect, like this is important because of X, Y, Z. And I think about that a lot as a composer. Like there's certain pieces that I listen to and I'm like, there's something compelling about the piece that gives it a certain kind of value. And in the writing program, they use a question to test the motive, how much of a motive is there. It's called the so what question. Like if you read a paper and you go, so what? Then it doesn't have a good motive. And so sometimes when I listen to pieces, I go, so what? Someone says, oh, my piece does this and this and this and this. And then I listen to it and I'm like, so what? And then someone else says, my piece does this and this and this. And then I listen to it and I'm like, I love that piece. I want to hear it again. And so I think a lot about that. I think it's very mysterious how we do that and composing too, something to think about.
Yeah. Well, I brought up the writing in part because your work often involves words. You write opera is a big part of what you do, and even otherwise, writing choral works and so on, including the excerpt we're going to hear. And also collaboratively, you've worked on a bunch of projects with another Princeton until recently Princeton person, Tracy K. Smith. And so clearly the word and poetry and text and so on is an important part of your work.
Yeah, and it's also funny that you mentioned the writing because I was always kind of afraid of writing, and I felt very suspicious of language in general as a kid. Like I loved composing because I could say something without saying anything at all, and so it was kind of this secret language, right? And so you could get up and like perform something for your high school, and people would clap, and they would have no idea what it was actually about. It could be about something you'd have something in your mind, but they would have something in their mind, and there's something about the abstractness of music that drew me, and so I have this kind of incredible admiration for writers because I find it terrifying.
Yeah.
And so writing opera for me was an ability to kind of like to speak dramatically about it, like heal this wound of this fear of language by collaborating with someone who had chosen language as their medium, hadn't sort of run from it like I did in a way, and it's been this kind of exciting thing. And I was thinking about it because someone was asking about opera, and music is of course abstract in a lot of ways, and it's all about these like circular kind of structures. So you have like A, B, A, verse, refrain, verse. You're always going in circles in music. Exposition, development, recapitulation, and words tend to go like forward in time, like cause and effect, like a narrative. One thing happens that causes something else to happen. It's like an arrow. And so like opera is about like bringing those two things together. But that's what I like so much about Tracy's work is that she thinks a lot in that sort of how do you deal with the paradox of having something repeat and yet also go forward in time. And so, yeah.
So maybe we'll start with an excerpt, speaking of not of Tracy, but she didn't write the text for this piece that we're going to hear an excerpt from.
This is Denise Levertov,
Right.
So not Tracy. And this is I think it's a choral piece, and this is like not an opera thing. So this is like taking like language and kind of fragmenting it. So you won't necessarily hear the language. It's about building a tower. It's kind of the Tower of Babel is what the poem is based on, but it's kind of drawing a connection between the Tower of Babel and like the cooling towers of like
nuclear power plants.
Yeah, it's like anyway.
Yeah.
But you won't, it'll just sound like music to you. It's the text is fragmented.
All right, so we'll just
I'll stop giving terrible descriptions of it.
Yeah.
Each
do kind of want to keep listening. So that
was The Crossing, by the way, the Crossing Choir down in Philadelphia, a really great group. Yeah.
So the piece is called The Tower in the Garden, and that's the second movement.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's on an album with, this is kind of one of the centerpieces of the album. There are a couple other pieces as well, is that right?
Yeah, the album shares the title as the title of the album, yeah.
Got it. So I know that non-composers are always curious about this, but composers are often very curious about this too. Like where did you start? Like, how does the process start for you? And does it start with a text, or like, how does it work for you? What's your process like?
Oh, goodness. Confusion, despair. I mean, I always feel like if I feel confident, like, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. One of the things, you said that quote, or you paraphrased Paul Lansky, and I feel like one of the things that was like really emphasized here in the program, I don't even know if this was intentional or not, was kind of counterintuitive thinking. Like, just like what you said about like, you're here to learn from us, sort of flipping things the opposite way. So, and so I feel like when I feel like I know what I'm doing, I'm in danger of doing something I've already done, or doing something that's boring, or doing something that's conventional, or something that will respond poorly to the so what question, so what, who cares? And so I look for a kind of confusion. I try to throw together a lot of signifiers that don't belong together, and try to kind of fight my way through it. And so The Tower in the Garden was started from, I knew this makes no sense, but this is where I started. I wanted to make a piece that was about Catholic mysticism, like sort of queer sensibility, and I wanted Thomas Merton to be involved, like things that just don't go together. I remember talking to Donald Nally about it, and he's like, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand how this.
He's the conductor of The Crossing.
Yeah, and so I reassured him by saying, neither do I. I don't know if it'll work or if it'll be any good. But then you sort of start to find connections and sort of put everything together. So, in The Tower in the Garden, Derek Jarman, who's this amazing filmmaker from the 80s, like punk filmmaker, he lived out in this place called Dungeness, which is right on it's sort of this really interesting part of the English coast. And there was a nuclear power plant, and then he tried to grow a garden in the rocks, because it's like a rock beach. And he grew this beautiful garden, but among the sort of most unlikely of places. And so the piece is all about that, which then segues into, he made a lot of sort of religious themed work about sort of gay life in the 80s. And anyway, so things sort of start to fit together. And so you go from a place of confusion and despair into hopefully some sort of, not a reconciling of the paradox, but some sort of like articulation of the paradox that feels true or of interest or of use in a piece. So, but in a more practical sense, I go to the piano and I play things, and if I find something that's interesting, I'll write it down. And something that's interesting is almost always something that's super simple, and something that I can quickly unleash my undergrad theory education on, and it will dismiss it out of hand. It'll go, that's just a C major chord in first inversion. Who cares? And I'll say, I don't know. There's something about it in this context that I love. And I play it for someone, and they'll say exactly that. Who cares? It's just a C major. And I'll say, okay, now I want to build a piece. I hear something there, but I want to build a piece that will make other people hear that, like a kind of a special thing, that there's something in that. It's kind of like falling in love with something and saying, I can see something in this object, and now I want to build the environment in which other people will be able to, in this case, hear it. And so I come up with these little things that don't, actually, I remember having a lesson here, and I brought in one, and I said, there's something there, I just need to find it. And then one of the teachers here said, well, what if there is actually nothing there?
It's good mentorship.
Yeah, I was terrified. I was terrified, and I was like, and actually that piece was a big failure, so maybe he was right. But it's actually a good question, because you're playing with it could be nothing, right. And so you have to sort of build a world in which it's not. I'm getting very philosophical, but suffice it to say that I'm always looking for something that you could not describe in a way that would interest anyone. You can only write a piece and then maybe they'll get interested in that. Because, like I've been listening to a lot of Sondheim. It feels like Sondheim year. And I listen to his melodies and I'm like, that's just like a little like, da, 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 da. It's just like the tiniest thing. And yet I like fall in love with these things. He like, puts it in the context in which it becomes iconic.
Yeah.
So I look for that sort of something that's not flashy.
Yeah. I've said exactly that. Like if I feel like if I understand what I'm doing, it's a problem. If I feel like I really know what I'm doing when working on a piece, it usually ends up not being very interesting to me in short order. I'm also reminded, I don't know, this is maybe a question, like if there's a point that I'm onto something, or when do you pass judgment? And I'm reminded of something that the composer Herbert Broom used to say all the time. He taught at Illinois for many years, very charismatic and opinionated composer. And he said, you don't know your own piece until you've heard it 100 times, which that's kind of unrealistic, but also there's an interesting message there in terms of not passing judgment too soon, and especially not too soon in the process of when you're trying you're in confusion, you're trying to find this thing that you don't understand. I don't know if that has any resonance with you.
It makes me think back to that comment of what if there's nothing there that I got in that lesson. And I think you have to for me, you have to make it so or try to make it so it leaps off the page and no one would even ask that question. Like you have to start, but the problem is you have to start with something where it would be dismissed. And then try to put in a context in which, just like I think Sondheim is pulling this off all the time. That's the best song. I'm like, okay, it has none of the classic melodic, all the things that you would start to try to write a good song with. It doesn't really have those things, and yet people love them. So I think finding what's special about something is only half the battle, right? The real hard part is presenting it in a way in which someone else, maybe the same person who dismissed it out of hand, it's a seduction, right? And then Beethoven is, always doing this, da 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 da, or whatever, like a minor third, who cares, and then he builds a symphony out of it. So this is very central to the tradition in a way.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll play a short piece of Nina's and talk a bit and then take it from there. Do you want to say anything about what we're going to see? Should the screen come down?
I'm trying to decide how shocked I want everybody to be. Maybe I'll give a little context. Okay. So this was something I made here at Princeton, actually, for a class here. It was a storytelling class. And it started off kind of similar to Greg. I've been doing a lot of writing and involving, writing a lot of poetry and writing a lot of songwriting and things like that. And I have been doing a series about different parts of the body. And a lot of my work in general, like my music, my writing, my visual art, as you'll see, has to do a lot with identity. And I always feel like art making is a way for me to kind of better understand the relationship between myself and my environment. And growing up, I was always very self-conscious of my eyebrows. It was something when I was growing up, I was always bullied for having a unibrow. And people would say, oh, Frida Kahlo, even though now I'm like, oh, Frida Kahlo's beautiful, thanks. But it was a real point of contention for myself. And I wrote this poem about, it was the whole thing was a metaphor about a civil war. And it really was actually one eyebrow fighting the other eyebrow to claim the land between. And I eventually, I think, I relate a lot to what you were saying, Greg, in the sense of I also kind of have itchy feet, and every time I'm doing something, I can't keep doing that over and over for years. I need to find something new to do, and kind of building a visual language was something that I've been doing as another evolution in my work. And I made a very zany video related to this eyebrow whole metaphor. Maybe I'll get up just so that y'all can see.
La 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 la.
Well, if you didn't already know, this should make it apparent that the world of contemporary composition is very broad. There's a lot of different kind of music being made, and when you hear Nina's, and not just among different people, but within individual composers who are making an enormous range of different kinds of music, you'll hear Nina's piece this weekend, which is this gorgeous orchestral piece, kind of very slow moving, using this one kind of motive that kind of fills till it gets to this huge, wonderfully full texture. It's a gorgeous piece, by the way. It's kind of the most iconic of ensembles, right? The Symphony Orchestra. And this same person makes this today. And I don't want to say this and have it somehow minimize what you're doing, but I think one of the things is that that's not that uncommon. In the sense, composers here at Princeton, but in general, are often really reaching widely to find the thing that they want to do to express what they're trying to do. So,
No, definitely. I think that it's a really important, I think what you were saying, Greg, too, like this feeling of being uncomfortable, I think is really important to art making in general and the creative process. And it doesn't mean like being uncomfortable in a way that harms yourself, but I think it's just like this need to learn. And I think that goes for a lot of different fields too. I feel like, my science background, I feel like that's a really important thing for like the scientific process too, like needing to learn, having a question that you need to answer. And I think that for me, a lot of this actually stemmed from the pandemic. Around that time, live concerts were being canceled, and I think a lot of orchestras were really struggling to make a way of keeping the concert experience going. And there was a lot of these kind of watered down click track videos, like the little Zoom module with all these little Brady Bunch squares of all the players. And I felt like it wasn't really the most creative use of video at that time. And then I kept thinking, like, I think this is an opportunity for me to try to start using video and try to do something new, which I was anyway kind of wanting to do. And then it just kind of built from there. And I think this quest to learn something new and to try to learn a new process. And a lot of this kind of also has gone back into my music making process, where I, even just in the way that I compose, I'm always trying to find a new way of working and coming up with ideas, whether that's on paper or whether that's in a notation software or whether that's like in a DAW or like Ableton or some kind of music program, like GarageBand kind of thing. So I think that's a common thing for a lot of artists.
So it just, to revisit this question of process, which you already started talking about. Well, you set this up really nicely, so I have an understanding of where that piece came from. How, in general, for pieces, or for the piece this weekend, Lumina, like, do you remember what the beginning of that process was for you, what you were reaching for, literally what you were doing with your hands or your body when you were making it?
Yeah, that piece, it's interesting, when I think about other pieces I've written since then, even other orchestral pieces, that piece, as you were saying with the Beethoven just being a minor third, this piece is basically a minor third for like the whole way through. And, a lot of that actually relates to just music I grew up listening to. So, I'm Indian American, and a lot of Hindustani classical music, a lot of Carnatic music is often based off of these particular melodic structures or rags and things like that. And a lot of them have this sort of limited pitch world, but there are all these characteristic motives from this one, I guess, like a rag is best described as a scale with personality. Like it has a specific ascent and descent pattern. There's all these characteristic phrases within. There are certain notes that you're supposed to emphasize, along with whatever extra musical connotations or time of day connotations it might have. And I think in a similar way, this piece is kind of built in that way, where it starts with only these two notes for a while, and then it gradually builds, and then the whole piece is really built off of that motive. And I think that a lot of music that I've written since then, I often feel like I relate a lot to the idea of sampling and build, like, drawing some connection to other kinds of like music by other artists who might be from a different point in time than me, and kind of trying to understand my intersection with those artists. And another piece I wrote very recently is drawing off of the original Stabat Mater hymn, which and then the whole thing is like a warping of that. So I think that that's something that is kind of built into my process, even with Lumina.
Yeah. I just ask you one more question. Thinking about, we talked about chemistry studies, flute studies, composition studies. I recently saw a piece where you got on stage yourself and were performing. I'm curious, of those things, how like being a performer sort of goes back to the origins of what composers did, right? And not all composers do that, but it's something you're maybe starting to do again. On the other hand, you've got this rigorous chemistry training in you as part of you. I'm just curious how much those play consciously in how you approach composing these days, or even thinking about what you're going to do next.
Yeah, I think that definitely my performance background, I think has been really important for me in the way I approach composing, in that it's always important to understand what it feels like to get on stage and be nervous and have to perform in front of other people. Also just to understand how things feel in the body when you're asking them to do something. And if I'm saying, oh, you have to crescendo there on this really awkward note and this awkward technical passage, like I should know what that feels like if I'm going to ask somebody to do that. But I think relating to that with this performance sort of side that I'm trying to do more, I think, again, it's like a notion of me being uncomfortable. And I've always had a lot of stage fright, I think, growing up. And even though it was something that I had wanted to do, as a flutist, I did a lot of that, but then over time with the pandemic, that goes away. You kind of start to emphasize like one thing over another. And for me, it was composing. But, I always wanted to kind of, again, put myself out there in that sort of position. And I think it's a way for me to also have an audience kind of feel the same vulnerability that I'm feeling when I'm writing music. And a lot of my music is very vulnerable. I mean, even this about the eyebrows. But I think it's important for me to see audiences relate to what I'm doing and see that uncomfortability in the moment. And with engineering, as you said, it's interesting. I think that also kind of relates a lot to things I do, in that I think having studied chemical engineering, it was really like a social awareness that whole degree was trying to build in its students, and in a really different way than I think in the arts. And I think it has, I don't really use all the equations I learned, all the calculus I had to do anymore. But I think a lot of stuff with engineering was about looking at a problem in a certain way. And it was often the opposite way that musicians look at that problem. And, I always think about like the Flint water crisis. I went to Michigan for my undergrad, and Flint was right there. And the way that engineers were, we had to do homework problems about the Flint water crisis, and they were exactly pinpointing what was going on and how they could solve it. And, versus in the music school, a lot of the emphasis was more on the emotional side of things, on kind of the human element, but maybe not understanding the technical side. And in a similar way, in the engineering world, maybe not understanding the emotional side. So I think a lot of my work is kind of drawing those two things together. And I think I always just want to be more informed and constantly learning about the world around me through anything that I do.
Yeah, I totally relate to your the problem-solving aspect of that kind of study. That is not necessarily about using equations in particular ways, but it's sort of a way of thinking, which in some ways actually also the kind of writing training that you teach or taught, and that also there's a certain kind of rigor about that is about framing questions and articulating. I'm not sure goals are the right word, but articulating sort of a kind of process that you're after. I will say that in my own physics degree as an undergrad, I had a number of what I can only describe as aesthetic experiences that are sort of what you expect to get from music, where something comes together in a way that you feel like all of a sudden things make sense in a way that you can't explain, right? Which is what music, I think, does a lot. Like a piece where you don't say, so what? It's usually like, I don't know why, right? Yeah. And I got that both in physics and music studies. Which
like the beautiful alignment. Like a lot of scientists will always, it's almost like a religious experience when they suddenly see things line up in a particular way that.
Well, in fact, the one example that I'm thinking of is the Maxwell's equations. If we have physicists here, they'll know what I'm talking about. But these 4 equations, and they demonstrate symmetry, which is something that scientists are so excited about symmetry. But they actually demonstrate broken symmetry. There's something that's wrong. And the thing that kind of really blew me away was seeing this thing that was almost perfect, but something that couldn't be squeezed into the way we like to explain the world. So you want to say something, Greg? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm just like... I feel like we're like in a class now, and so I'm like going back to like 2004 or something, and I'm like wanting, one of the things I taught kids theory when I went to New York for to make money, and I also love kids, and we would teach them like scales, like what is a scale? It's like whale, snail, whale, snail. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Whole, semi, whole. Anyway. To build a scale, you have a kind of broken symmetry, right? It's not like scales that are symmetrical, like whole tone scales, chromatic scales, octatonic scales. They sound scary to the kids, right? Like symmetry in music is oftentimes feels the opposite of how you might imagine. Symmetry would feel like stasis, but symmetry often creates a sense of like play a whole tone scale. Like disorientation. Sometimes it's thought of as like the irrational, right? Like, right. And so there's something about this. I don't know that I like the word broken, but this kind of lopsidedness that like keeps things moving in music. And I think about that so much. It's like a problem, a question and a problem inherent in like a diatonic scale. Right. Which is like, how do we like reconcile this like thing that's not symmetrical, right? And so it's like, I think about that with questions, like you can ask question like, actually Amanda's, they talk about this in the writing program, like depending on your discipline changes, just as you were saying, the question you ask about a phenomenon, right? And so like thinking about like what is a musical problem, you know, and it's not like a math problem, but it's something like the lopsidedness of the diatonic scale. It's a problem that then generates like millions of pieces.
Right. Well, and to give an example of what Greg's talking about, if you imagine the piano keyboard, right, it has a set of white keys and then alternating 2 black keys and 3 black keys, right? If you imagine that instead being just alternating black and white keys, that's terrifying to a composer, because there's no map there. There's no grid really. It's just you get disoriented because you don't have that lopsided.
It all looks the same.
It all looks the same, and that's the chromatic scale or the Holden scale, whatever it is that doesn't have something that kind of helps orient you.
Yeah. It's like a story where there's no complication or problem or tension, right?
It's too perfect. Yeah.
And then there's no story. It's like, and everyone lived happily ever after. You know?
We're done. Yeah. Well, I should see if there are questions from you all that you'd like to ask Nina or Greg. Yeah.
Since I have questions for both of you, but since we were watching the video and our youngest audience member sat still and was mesmerized by it, I wondered if you thought about the age of your audience when you compose.
Oh, I do actually. In a different way, I think, you know, a big part of my process or my practice actually has been education and teaching, and I've been doing a lot more educational commissions also and commissions for youth groups. And I think because of that, you know, teaching is such a special field in that a good friend of mine said it's like the one field where you can't be a prodigy in it. Like you have to go through that experience and understanding humans and their brains and how they learn, and it's always going to be different. And I think because of that, it's just every time I'm in a room with kids, I'm mesmerized by them. Like I learn so much about their brains, the way they think. And, you know, a recent thing I did was a Mad Libs style piece for a youth group. And I really wanted it to be something where they could learn about not only the compositional process, but also like connect it to the writing process in general. And with that piece, I was thinking a lot about fairy tales and the fact that fairy tales always tended to center a particular kind of character. You know, if you think of Cinderella and the way Disney has portrayed Cinderella, you know, it's always a particular gender of character. It's always a particular race. They always look a certain way. And I wanted it to be something where any kind of character could be centered. I mean, it could even be like an inanimate object that was like Cinderella, like that is the star. And, you know, I think by doing that and turning it into kind of like a Mad Lib style experience, like it was almost more of like me coming up with a lesson plan than writing a normal piece. And in watching students work through that process, you know, there were so many things that came up that I would never have anticipated. And I also even like the kinds of sounds that the whole thing was that they come up with words and then they have to translate it into sounds on their instruments, and then it fits in the score, which has all these blanks for their sounds to be fit into the process. And you know, the sounds that they came up with were like any composer's dream. They were like the most adventurous thing. Like the brass players were like, I'm going to take off my mouthpiece and like make some weird sound. And I would not have thought I did not think that they would want to do that. So I think because of that, you know, even with things like this video, I know that I could imagine myself if I was watching this when I was younger. You know, I think back to a lot of this stemmed from like my own childhood insecurity and me trying to work through that. And it's a little bit like therapy, I feel like, with composing. And I do think about what is it like for somebody young to look at this and how they process their own selves. But yeah, I think it's becoming a greater and greater part of my practice in general. And I think it's another area where I feel like I can keep learning, because like learning how other people's brains work, it's like I'll never really know how other people's brains work. But I can just keep learning more and more about them.
I mean, it strikes me as that question, it's a great question, and it's one that is a part of a broader set of questions about who composers are imagining when they're writing their music, which is a fraught subject because it's impossible to really know how anybody else is going to absorb and take in what you do. But we still try, and it's whether I'm thinking about my mother or my kid or my teacher or you, that's going to lead you in different directions. And I think the notion of attending to like how a younger person, somebody who's 8 or 9 years old is that's a wild thing to think about. Did you want to add anything to that, Gregory?
I mean, I've been able to write for opera for kids, which is a fun thing because it's almost a cliche, but it has to be really, like you can't. There's no room for error with kids. Like they're not going to read super titles. Like they have to understand it. Like it has to move really fast. All these things that like opera depends on that the kids will not permit.
Right.
And so it was fun to write a kids opera for Chicago Lyric, and they take it out on the road. And one kid, actually, speaking of your screen comment, one kid came up. They just toured it again this fall, and I went out, and the producer came up to me and she said, "Yeah, one kid said I love that movie." Like it was a live performance. And just, I guess,
became a movie.
It became a screen somehow. Yeah. And I thought, I guess that's a weird sort of compliment.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm so curious. So when you're composing music, obviously you hear it a certain way in your head. So what is the delta between what you hear in your head and then how musicians and conductors interpret that music? And is there a delta, and how do you deal with the delta? How much leeway do they get to interpret your composition?
Oh, that's a lot. I got really interested when I came here. I was getting into the sort of counterintuitive things, so I thought I'm gonna talk about Handel all the time. I'm gonna just study Handel because that seemed like the most uncool thing to do as a Princeton graduate student. Building all these instruments and stuff, and I'm like, I'm gonna go look at a lot of Handel. I'm gonna marinate in it. And which is maybe why me and Anthony Costanzo became friends, because Anthony's been marinating in that his whole life. But one of the things I love about Handel is there's nothing there in the music. Like the music, and yes, there's like a tradition, but there's something about putting in the line itself, that the line and the notes and rhythms sort of tell you how to do it. Or there's something invisible in the notation. And we can't do that entirely now because Handel is, again, working with singers who had been singing opera seria, and he's working a tradition and they knew exactly what to do. But there's something about that, going back to Sondheim, there's something about a Sondheim, you don't need anything in the notation, you're gonna get pretty close to the essence of what's there. Somehow the line tells you how to perform it. And so I'm getting more and more interested in that, even as I'm also trying to, obviously lead people in the right direction. But I find, and this is why I got so interested in Handel, that singers would sing Handel. I was working with a lot of early music singers. They would sing it better than they would sing my music. And I would pull out the sort of a little bit of a thing we composers fall back on, is this idea of tradition. Well, they're thinking of the Handel tradition. But I think that's too much of an excuse, because then I would say, sing it like Handel, and it still wouldn't sound good, And so I really got excited about opera because I would find I would revise a line, or I would sort of move things around a little bit. I wouldn't add too much more like dynamics or hairpins or descriptive phrases or anything. I would just kind of be like, how can I make it better? And then all of a sudden they'd sing it. There would be no instructions from me. Then all of a sudden it was right, without the communication, without trying to control it. And I was like, oh, there's some mystical hidden dimension of notation. And so like I think a lot about that, and how to be able to give it to a player, and then it just kind of happens.
Or they find it. Maybe they don't find it quite as quickly as they find Handel because they found Handel, but they do find it.
Yeah, and if you do opera, you know, what's great about opera is you have a bunch of people who move to some city like Indianapolis, you know, you have all these, and they move there for a month, right? And they rehearse this opera and then they put it up, and so it's like this community of musicians around this book, which is a score, which the composer writes. And it's like you get to watch singers like find their way to something, which is very different than like, you know, the very short process of other processes. And you realize, oh, they actually sort of find their way there, and then and to me, then there's a certain kind of commitment to it that's completely different than if you were to try to really control it with notation. Anyway, I think about that a lot, but you know.
This is a really interesting question. This notion of a delta, which I have thoughts about, but I will. But with that answer in particular, is the place that they arrive a place that you already know, or is it a place that they sit with the book, they discover how to perform this piece, and maybe it's not exactly what you thought it was going to be beforehand?
Yes and no. You know, there's this way that like. Tracy and I talk about this a lot because we've written an opera together. We're writing a big opera that premieres this summer. And we talk about like, it's kind of a cliche, but like, how do you follow the work? So it's like everyone, it's like there's this thing, it's like you walked through the forest and you got to this ravine and you looked in and there was this glowing, magical something or other. And I'm like, oh, I see it. And then you come back to the village and then there's all these musicians there and you're like, it's over there. Like, and like your score is this thing that's trying to point them in the direction so that they can walk over and look and be like, oh, I see it. And there's always this point in an opera rehearsal process, if it's going right, where everyone starts ignoring the composer. If it's happening at the beginning, you're in trouble. But if it happens like in week 3, and then all of a sudden you feel useless, no one's asking you questions, you somehow seem less popular than normal, it's because they found their way and they're looking in and they see it and they're like, oh, we don't need you anymore. And so like, and I feel like Tracy and I talk about this, like how do you like get there so that it couldn't be exactly what you're picturing because all you have is an image of it. It's not the thing itself. That they're not going straight to the source, if you will. And that a score is trying to get musicians to, you're trying to lead them somewhere and you're like, look at that over there. And they're like, oh, got it. And you didn't describe it, right? You actually led hopefully to, and so then what they're doing, of course, is their interpretation, but you're all looking at the same thing finally. And so there's a sense of control over, we're all looking at the same thing, as Kevin Newberry, this director I work with, always says, we're all telling the same story. Then you know it's going to be more successful. So there's this weird feeling of it being both, this idea of the composer has something in their head and they're trying to be very specific and have someone else do it is like, I think the wrong way to think of it, you know. It's a very 20th century way of thinking of it.
Did you want to add anything to that, Nina?
Yeah, the only thing I might add is, you know, kind of going off to what you're saying about like performance practice, you know, like Handel, you know, there is sort of this built-in pedagogy that goes into this, and students have been studying it for a long time. But I think in terms of cultural context, I think that's definitely something that I think about, you know, when I am composing, and I definitely have in mind, you know, if I'm writing for orchestra, what have these orchestra musicians, what have they learned, and what is part of their performance practice? What is the rehearsal schedule, you know? And I think it's a little bit different than when I'm working, you know, probably in a more collaborative chamber setting. But something that I would add to this is, along with this idea of just communication, the best example of this I can think of is sort of a friend and mentor of mine, Rena Esmail, who's a really amazing composer who works a lot in these sort of cultural collaborative settings where she'll often have like a Hindustani classical performer as a concerto soloist with an orchestra. And in the rehearsal itself, she has to navigate a lot of this sort of communication, not just between her and the ensemble and the soloist, but also just between like the orchestra and the soloist. And it's really interesting, all the stories that she has of just that process. And it's beyond just even like everything outside of the music. I mean, it's also just like watching a conductor is really, familiar in terms of one cultural practice, but maybe not in the other. Or, improvising might be really familiar in one cultural context and not in the other. And I think that that's something that I actually think it's a really interesting problem to have. And it's something that I also just feel a lot internally in my own work, where I think, I don't know, this is so reflective of like a first generational experience, like the way that even just music from one cultural context has come and is distilled in my mind and is something totally different, just because I was born in the US, and like the way I hear something is going to be really different than the way my parents heard it, having them being born in a different country than me. And I think I've been, before it was always a really scary problem, but I think nowadays I feel like it's like a really interesting thing to tackle creatively and in a way that it's just, again, part of this learning process, like learning who these people are as people, beyond just how do I get them to crescendo here or something.
I'll just say couple things about that. I think the world of composing today is so broad. In the particular context today, talking about PSO, writing for symphony orchestra, the delta is a problem. Like you typically for an orchestra get a very short amount of rehearsal time because you've got a lot of people there. And for composers that have had this experience, when the delta is big, like the gap between what I thought was going to happen and what happens, when it's big, that's usually not a good thing. I'm usually kind of frustrated by that. And I think people writing for orchestra try to get really good at maximizing what they can get from that short rehearsal time. The other side of it, though, for me, often that delta is the most interesting thing. And Nina mentioned this, collaborative spaces where you are entering into you're trying to create a space where you can discover music together. I remember a rehearsal some years ago that I had with the group So Percussion, which some of you may know, ensemble in residence at Princeton. I wrote a big piece for them called Neither Anvil Nor Pulley. And one of the movements, I came to the first rehearsal with 43 pages that were mostly empty. They had a few little things here and here. And I said, okay, let's see what we can find here together. And so I actually, in that case, there wasn't a delta. There was like, let's discover something together. And I think in the world of composition today, all of those things exist at Princeton and elsewhere, and even within particular composers. Yeah. Did that get at your question? Yeah. So I think we're getting close to finishing here, right? So should I take one more question? Yeah, one more question here. This is random. So.
Thank you. This might be a very short answer from you, but listening to you talk about your process and the discomfort and the struggle to make it come into something that seems right to you reminded me of a book I read not too long ago called Orfeo by Richard Powers. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't help wondering if any of you were familiar with that book, and if you were, it's about a composer who struggles his whole life with different ways of approaching his music, and he never really quite gets it, I don't think. Whether if you're familiar with it, did it ring true to you as a struggle that you might not conquer ever? Or is it just another so what story?
I've read a bunch of Richard Powers, but not that one. Books about composers are often very difficult for, I don't know about you, but for composers to read. But maybe I'll take that one on. The last one I read was his book about the trees, the Overstory, I think it was called. Yeah. But I don't. Have either of you read that?
I haven't read it.
Yeah. So. Okay, well then, none of us have read it, and so we'll read it and get back to you. So it'll be a very long answer. So maybe we'll take your question then.
Okay, well, I was very interested, you mentioned context, and I always thought, in the process of composing, what comes before the note, what comes after the note, And the feeling of it, this is really complex, I'm sorry, but the feeling and the emotion of the change from one tone to another tone, that to me seems to be the epitome of what I'm trying to strive for in the work of writing a piece of music. And it's about the orchestration and the sounds combined. So when you're composing, yeah, you're thinking of like a chord structure perhaps, or a melodic structure, okay? But what do you guys do when you think, okay, that's kind of saying what I want, but I want it stronger, or I want it more demure, or I want it like schizophrenic? Do you guys like work with lots of different kind of structures of sound, layers of different instruments? And how do you approach that?
I feel like my whole day of composing is like, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and I'm like, take this piece, and I'm like, no, like all this fancy education, and it's like a kind of like, if there's something, like I write something down and there's like a very faint glimmer of something that I think's interesting, something that perhaps someone else wouldn't hear, maybe I'm even imagining, doesn't even matter in a way. And then I'll like start making moves. I tell my students it's like playing a video game. I like make a move, and it got dimmer. Okay, that didn't work. Like I make a move, it got a little stronger. Yeah. And so it's almost like this, for me, it's almost like something that it feels almost idiotic in a weird way. And so I'm constantly and then I'm like, it got a little, and this path seems promising, and then I hit a dead end, and then you go back. And so there's this way of just kind of, so all of those things that you said would come into play for me, but then I learn more, and as I like do that like thousands of times, I start to understand in an intuitive way what the rules are of this thing I'm trying to grow or focus or make bigger, make more apparent. And you just sort of like, it's like for me, it's like almost like scientific. I'm like a typical artist. I'm speaking about science. I know nothing about science. But I feel like I do, which is important for me. Whereas I want to ask a question. You perform a little experiment, and then you get your results. Did the glow get brighter, or did it get dimmer, right? You don't actually know what the answer is. I feel like I have enough theory training where I'm like, I'm gonna like bring this scalpel in, and I'm gonna do this, and then hook up this thing, and I have a lot of like stuff I can do. But like, those are just all these tools that are sitting over there. All it matters is when I do something, does the thing I want like grow or diminish? And so then it becomes like almost like crazily time-consuming trial and error, but eventually it starts to grow. And then by the end of the piece, you kind of know, I know how I'm going to fix this. Like in revisions, you're like, this scene is sagging here. I think I know how to make it not sag. And you can try 3 things and only 2 will fail, rather than having 17 fail, which is what happens at the beginning, which is why the beginning kind of sucks, honestly, for me.
Yeah, I think to add to that, there's another delta, which is like the delta between your intention and what is on the paper. And that's a real, I remember one of my first teachers used to say like his whole growth as a composer has been to minimize that, like trying to get closer and closer to what his actual intentions are. And I think a step beyond that though is sometimes myself personally, I try to be a planner, but I'm not. Like I tend to write by intuition, and then I'll start like similarly. I'll try something, and I'm like, maybe I'll go here. Let's do it, rather than kind of mapping everything out. I've tried to be better at mapping, but sometimes it doesn't happen. But I was just thinking yesterday. I just taught a lesson to a student of mine, and they were trying to figure out dynamics for their piece, and they had this whole backstory of what they thought the piece was going to be about, but then they didn't really have a clear idea of like the actual, like how loud they wanted everything to be, like the actual like character musically of what they wanted besides the narrative they had developed. And they first put forte in the beginning, and then it's like, what would happen if we put pianissimo there? Like really thought, how would that change it? And then they were like, huh, actually I like that better. And it was like the total opposite of what they thought. And sometimes that happens to me too. When I'm composing, it's like sometimes it's the opposite thing of what you thought you were going for. So it's not even just about trying to match your intention. It's also sometimes your intention might change over the course of the process, which is always a fun experience when that happens.
Yeah, I'm thinking about both of you are saying there's this, it can be quite demoralizing because you're trying to find this thing that makes it right, gets to the thing that I think you're describing that you're after. And it can be really hard. And I think we get better because we have more tools in the toolkit and more experience to draw on. But I think in some ways, for me anyhow, one of the most important things is like, okay, I've been here before. I think I'm going to be able to get through this. Whereas like as a beginning composer, sometimes I think people try to start composing. Oh, this is too hard. I can't do this. I'm not a composer. I can't write music. Yeah. Whereas I feel like I'm not a composer. I can't write music all the time. It's like, yeah, but I did write all these other pieces. I have done this before, right? So there's a kind of a sense of like, yeah, I know how to get through this difficult spot here.
I was going to say, I think that has to do with this sort of great myth that has grown up around composing, that composing, it's so easy to hide the labor, to get rid of all the 17 versions that didn't work, and now even easier.
Right.
You know, I save as when I save things, so there's a long trail of my idiocy. Like there's like Love Story 37. You know, and that's the piece that's being performed. You know, there's tons of drafts of things, but I think that as a very short story, when I was in music school, there was a violinist who would come to dinner and he would see like, oh, I was relaxing and I didn't practice much today. And then there was a violinist who would come to dinner and they'd be like, I practiced 17 hours today or whatever it was. Well, of course, the pianist or the violinist who never said they practiced was excellent, and the one who said they're practicing all the time was struggling, and it was actually the opposite. The one who said he never practiced was actually really practicing, but he was putting on that veneer of I'm just a good violinist. And so my composers, my students come in and they feel like something is going terribly wrong. If they're like the puzzle pieces are like, oh, it didn't fit. Oh, I'm going to give up. You know, and I really like jigsaw puzzles, but I understand why some people find them despairingly, exhausting. There's a way in which we've decided that composing is not a craft; it's more of a kind of magical talent thing, and so I think that's something that you have to sort of break through. But people don't really want to break through it because then it means you're gonna have to do a lot of work. A lot of work. Like a lot of work. Tchaikovsky said once to somebody who wanted to be a composer, he's like, you have no idea how much work it's going to be. Because they're like, oh, it sounds like it's going to be great, But I think that's,
And then we all find out too late.
I know. Then you've gone too far down the path and you thought, oh, I thought I'd be good at this point, but you realize that's never going to happen. So.
Well, thank you both, and thank you for the PSO for having us, and enjoy the concerts this weekend.